Pupils got their GCSE results this morning, and last week it was A-levels. In both cases, the proportion of top grades fell following the grade inflation of the pandemic years, with the biggest drops in England as the exam regulators in Wales and Northern Ireland are returning to pre-pandemic grading levels slightly slower. So what do you make of this year's results so far, Rachel? I know that the GCSEs have just dropped at the time of recording.
Well, it's kind of what everyone expected, which is that grades have fallen. And it's not just what was expected, it was what the government kind of wanted to happen, because there's been this panic over grade inflation since COVID, the mutant algorithm, the what do you do when kids don't take exams, kids today are getting by too easy or whatever. So they were trying to get back to 2019 levels, which is what we've seen today, which on a kind of macro scale is what the government wanted. Now we're back in line with our metrics. We can all measure things, the way that we want to. But for the kids involved in it, it just feels really, really unfair. And the discrepancies from COVID and from all the disruption, sort of teacher strikes, constant churn in the government, over the last couple of years, they're going to get a piece of paper that says you didn't pass your maths or English, which is going to affect them in later life. And the government's like, everything's fine because we got back to 2019 levels.
But is it not important to get back to those levels in terms of trust in the national standards that we set ourselves? I remember for a podcast episode that's not yet come out, Armando Iannucci and I, for our other series, went to go and visit some students who had just finished their A-levels in Harlow in a school in quite a deprived area. And they were actually telling us, I remember, that, they didn't want it to appear as if things were any easier for them than it had been for sort of previous cohorts. They didn't like the idea that future employers or universities might think that they were given an easy ride. So I do think there's sort of two sides to this. While I absolutely take the point that there will be many people disappointed who have had a really rough time anyway, spent most of their school years in the pandemic. Some of the A-level students wouldn't have sat exams properly before. And so it is, it's very tough on this cohort.
Yeah, I think you also always need the proportions of grades to reflect the fact that you're going to have to measure people of different abilities. You can't have everyone getting high grades because it basically means it's no longer a high grade. It makes the whole system redundant. I don't think that's so much the issue. As you say, Anoosh, they do have to return back to some sense of proportionality. It's more the fact that, as you were saying, Rachel, everyone within the system over the past 3 or 4 years or so has had a horrible time with COVID, with all the debacles that we've had every single summer, it seems, with the government scrambling, whether it's Gavin Williamson or others, scrambling to put in place COVID measures for exams. And then on top of that, we've had the strikes. Then lots of these kids are going to go to university, and then they're also going to have strikes and disrupted teaching there. So, it might have returned to what it needs to be, but that doesn't mean that they've had a good time or a fair time.
Yeah, and actually what's interesting is when these results have been coming out, I noticed that on the day of the A-level results, we were actually officially in the government's grid, we were in Health Week, and it made me think, actually, the government is so different on education now. It's not at the forefront of its rhetoric or its priorities compared to, I remember when I first was covering politics back in 2012, I think it was, you had Michael Gove's reforming agenda, and actually sort of academic standards were the lodestar of that coalition government going into the next Conservative government. It feels really different now.
Yeah, they've stopped talking about it, which I think is interesting because on some metrics, education is one of the areas where the Tories can point to some successes. Earlier this year, Britain moved up to, I think, 4th place in children's literacy, which the government could totally say is partly a result of Michael Gove's reforms, whether or not specialists in education believe that. But that's a thing that they could point to as a success. And they barely mentioned it. And they don't seem to want to draw attention to that potentially positive legacy. I think education is also one of the departments that has seen the most churn. So we had 5 education secretaries last year in 2022. If you cover
That's a crazy stat in itself.
One of them was Michelle Donnellan, who was education secretary for I think 36 hours, but her picture is on the wall. Yeah. They've got all the portraits up of education secretaries, and hers is there. And if you count the COVID years, Gavin Williamson, that's 6. That's 6 education secretaries during a period of immense disruption where you would really, really hope that someone had sat down at the beginning and gone, okay, we're closing schools for COVID, we're going to have to do something about exams, there's going to be lost learning, there are going to be real discrepancies in the kids who have support and technology and parents who can help them at home and the kids who don't. How are we going to make that up? What are we going to do with the mental health challenges? Like, this is a real issue for an entire generation of children. Who are we going to have sort of shepherding them through this? And the answer is a string of ministers who barely had time to, work out where their desk was before they were moved on. And I think that shows priorities, right?
Definitely,
doesn't it?
Yeah, it says something in itself. I mean, I remember trying to FOI the cost of framing that picture of Michelle Donnelly, who was Education Secretary. They told me they already had the frames in stock, in store at the department. Yeah, so unfortunately, I didn't get my headline.
I didn't see that piece.
Yeah, I didn't write it because they didn't spend any money on that in the end. But
it
tells you something.
It's interesting what you were saying about continuity within the department. Nick Gibb is obviously the schools minister, has been there for a very long time, on and off since 2010, and he wrote a piece I think last year for the higher education supplement which basically made this point, Rachel, that we've had quite radical changes within the education system. Tory MPs, the government don't talk about them, and he basically says it's because he thinks MPs don't even know what they are. They don't know, for instance, they don't know that phonics is a massive part of what the government introduced into literacy. They don't know so much about changing or allowing most schools to become academies. I think in 2021, around 80% of schools, secondary schools, were now academies. It's huge numbers. It's becoming the norm. You don't hear Tory MPs talk about this at all, even though they could say, when people ask, what have you done since 2010? And they look quite quizzical and they say, we delivered Brexit, and they sort of scramble around. They don't go, okay, well, we cut spending for most departments. That's not really what they point to. They could say, look, we have introduced education reforms. You can agree with them, you can disagree with them, but that is something we've done.
Well, yeah, I mean, those education reforms transformed the way that education is structured, right? It was a huge change that they can point towards. And like you say, Rachel, there are some metrics which suggest that education has improved in this country. But I think what's interesting when you look at the results that we're seeing coming out this year is actually one of the aims of Michael Gove's reforms was to rebalance, was to close those regional disparities in educational outcomes. And actually you've seen in the Northeast, in Yorkshire and the Humber, the proportion of top grades is actually lower than it was back in 2019, whereas in London and the Southeast, it's higher. So those disparities have actually widened. And, in this era of so-called levelling up, that runs against, the social mobility that has always been Michael Gove's intention with those kind of reforms. And now he's levelling up secretary. It's his priority in government now as well.
Yeah, and it's probably just worth reminding people what academies are. They're basically taking the schools out of local authorities, giving them more independence. And I think that does bring about some problems. I mean, the whole idea is basically giving parents more choice. They can choose where they send their kids, and therefore that will encourage schools, just like a market, to increase their standards. It also means, however, that you have very confused lines of accountability. Rather than the council being responsible for schools, it's not always clear, do you have like the broader academy trust or the head teachers? It's quite unclear who should be held accountable. You also got some problems with academies excluding kids who are problematic, and then them having to go to local authority schools, which basically pulls down the averages within local authority schools and skews the statistics. So there's lots of problems about measuring whether academies have been successful or not. I think some of the studies at the moment basically say that there's not much difference, but because of some of the reasons I just spoke about, you can't actually make a fair measure.
Now, I think it's very difficult to measure the impact of academies and also free schools. There was news, I think last week, that Eton has partnered with a whole load of new free schools to sort of bring the Eton ethos to state schools. But even if you're not totally sold on this idea of a market in education, Michael Gove is, like the Conservative Party is, so they could still be championing it and saying this is something that we've done, and they're not. In terms of levelling up, I don't think it's actually that surprising, because we've talked before about how during austerity certain things were ring-fenced, and obviously health was technically ring-fenced and education was sort of partially ring-fenced, but everything else was cut, which meant that a lot of challenges that would have been addressed by local authorities or social work or in the sort of community sector ended up having to be dealt with by teachers in schools. So if you've got areas where you've just had a whole load of local council funding cut for community centres or for supporting really low income families or vulnerable children, and they're turning up at school with the same issues but no one to help them, that puts extra pressure on the teachers in those schools, who are then able to spend less time actually teaching. So I don't think it's surprising that those regional disparities come out in the education outcomes, because like those challenges have to be dealt with somewhere. And one of the reasons for the teacher strike, obviously a big one was pay, but one of them was teachers just going, we are so burnt out because we're having to deal with so many challenges that are not about education. They're about failures in the community, and we're having to pick up the pieces.
Well,
yeah, and also education spending did fall. It fell by 9% in real terms per pupil in the decade after 2010. And then you saw in the autumn statement, Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak announced that they want to inject about 2.3 billion, I think it was, into education. And that was basically Rishi Sunak saying, this is the thing that's very close to my political heart. That all that will do by 2024, by next year, is basically return us to the level of 2010 funding. So you've got over a decade there of underfunding and a missed opportunity. And as you say, Rachel, that is compounded by the fact that you've seen massive cuts to local authorities and all those support mechanisms around schools. Pay as well. I mean, pay has gone down, especially for more senior teachers. That's gone down massively, and that's led to problems with meeting recruitment targets. I think on average for secondary school teachers, it's only around 60%. So that was the whole farce of Rishi Sunak standing up in January and saying, well, we're going to teach maths to every kid until they're 18.
I think now we're going to teach chess as well.
Yeah.
And that's going to fix everything.
Yeah, that's the backtrack. Okay, we're going to put a chessboard in a park. I mean, he didn't have the teachers to do it, he didn't have the funding to do it, he didn't have the plan to do it, he didn't have the time to do it. There was no chance of him delivering that. And hence you've not heard anything about it since.
Yeah, you've not heard anything about it since. This is the thing, these phantom announcements that don't actually come through. How are you going to do that? How are you going to recruit the maths teachers? There's a shortage, like you were saying, in maths teachers, as there are in so many other teachers. There's also a rise in teachers teaching their non-expert subjects. So you might get a PE teacher teaching RE and stuff. I've visited schools where teachers have had all sorts of different responsibilities. And like you say, Rachel, it's not just the curriculum that's putting pressure on them, but it's also, they have to act as mental health professionals, social workers, sometimes cleaners. I once met a head teacher at a school in Sheffield who was sometimes having to clean the toilets herself. It's crazy.
And the buildings are falling apart as well.
And the building, exactly. The capital investment has been so poor that the buildings are now in really bad state in some parts of the country. So, the job of being a teacher is very different before, and the experience of being a pupil in a school is very different, because you don't have those support mechanisms around you, like you were saying, Rachel, because so much of the kind of public realm, which matters to education, has been cut. You could point to these reforms in education and say narrowly we have transformed the way that education is delivered in this country. But when you've run down the context that education is delivered in, then you do get these kind of disparities and results that aren't just down to the pandemic.
I think another challenge is that when the Tories do talk about schools and young people, they seem very focused on culture war aspects of it. So are teachers teaching the curriculum right? Are we wokeifying the curriculum, like rows over how you teach history, rows obviously over how teachers deal with issues of gender identity and debate and stuff in schools. And like that stuff is important on like an individual level, but wouldn't it be great if they were talking about how do we make up for the lost learning during COVID? How do we actually get pupils to the standard of maths they should be at 16 before talking about whether they should be taking it to 18. I remember during the summer leadership contest, Rishi Sunak was talking about how we should have a British baccalaureate and scrap A-levels completely and reform the education system entirely around that. And you were like, that might be a really good idea. It works in other countries. Who knows? What we do know is like the education department asked him when he was Chancellor for, I think it was 10 billion of catch-up funding for schools, and he gave them like a fraction of that, and that was money that could have been spent on helping kids who hadn't learnt anything for 2 years. And that's before you even get into all the children who've dropped out of the education system because of some of the issues during the pandemic. Like those are the big structural things that a government needs to be grappling with if they really want to improve educational outcomes. And instead you've got like are they teaching Churchill correctly on the curriculum?
Yeah, and you've got the government ducking the big issues in education. How about Labour? Labour, I feel, with Bridget Phillipson as Shadow Education Secretary, she's someone who's been seen for a long time as a rising star in the party and, is quite a prominent voice. Still, it doesn't quite feel to me that it's at the forefront of their priorities.
No, I think what has basically happened is that the plan was for childcare to be their key policy within the education sphere. Rachel Reeves has sort of come in and dumbed that down a little bit, and it's not clear how much funding they're going to have to increase the provision of childcare. The government has also announced some money and some policy on childcare, so that's basically changed.
It's taken the shine.
It has a little bit,
yeah.
so I think that's one of the problem, and I think because of that, move focus a little bit to schools, teacher retention, the curriculum, basically expanding it towards creative subjects, oracy, that funny word that we heard a couple of weeks ago, which I think basically means rhetoric, teaching kids how to speak and to convey arguments. So there's some of the ideas. It's not particularly radical. I went through their briefing document again this morning. The key thing to note is basically that all of these policies are funded through a £1 billion fund that they're going to raise from imposing VAT on private schools. Great. Okay, cool, good. £1 billion isn't a lot at all in the perspective of government spending. It's also not a lot when we look at some of the numbers you were talking about, Rachel, in terms of returning schools to where they were before the pandemic. It's also not a lot in the context of how much money they've not received in the past 10 years. And it's also not a lot when you look at teacher retention and the collapse in pay in the past 10 years. So again, we don't want to always bang on about money and Labour's reluctance to engage in that issue, but I do think education is one policy area where that's key.
I suppose they've got a story to tell in this kind of shattering the class ceiling thing. So, they often champion the stories of Wes Streeting and Bridget Phillipson, but also, Keir Starmer himself talks a lot about his own upbringing, and Rachel Reeves about, playing chess against the public school boys.
Yeah.
So they've got the makings of a coherent kind of narrative there.
Definitely.
It's just, as you say, the nuts and bolts of the policy are a little vague. But I suppose shifting the emphasis on the curriculum into giving kids in less privileged schools, better confidence, whether it's through creative subjects or public speaking, is the markings of a sort of new vision for education, even if they're not... even if they've not fleshed it out that.
I don't know, is it a new vision? I mean, it's great. It's a good policy. It's really important, completely behind it. Is it an education policy that's going to revolutionise education, and perhaps in the same way that Michael Gove did in 2010, 2012? It's not of the same magnitude, I don't think.
No, they're not suggesting a restructure of how,
and then
how
the other thing,
work.
Given that academies are now at about 80% of secondary schools, the other question is, do they basically double down on academies and accept that now basically the system they've inherited is based on academies, and we're going to try and make that work better? Because one of the problems with trying to revert the academy policy is basically that local authorities no longer have the capacity, funding, expertise to deliver schooling in the same way that they did 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. And one of the reasons that you've got more parent choice now is a demographic one. So in 2010, when Michael Gove was doing a lot of this and giving parents and teachers the power to set up new schools, there was a case for setting up lots of new schools because there were new pupils. We needed more school places because people are having fewer children, and that's like filtering through the school system. Now we don't have that particular challenge, and so there are areas where parents have loads of choice because the schools don't have enough kids, which is a really interesting challenge because theoretically it gives parents more choice, and theoretically as well you could say if you've got fewer pupils and the same amount of spending, you've got more money per pupil, but that's not great for an education system to be like, oh, we don't have enough kids,
especially not a marketised one which needs the demand theoretically to drive up standards. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.